All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning from Washington, D.C. Good afternoon to those of you joining us in Europe. It's great to have you all here. My name is Scott Cullinane, and I'm the Executive Director of the U.S.-Europe Alliance. We are a bipartisan initiative dedicated to mobilizing Americans to advocate for the enduring transatlantic partnership. In these COVID times we're in now, USEA has launched a virtual event series, which we've dubbed Transatlantic Chats. These are concise conversations where we bring together voices from across America and across Europe to discuss an important issue of the day. And before we dive into our topic for this session, I'd like to ask everyone to please visit our website, useurope.org, where you can sign up for our email list and follow us on Twitter at USE Alliance. And that is the best way to stay up to date on all of our upcoming events and activities. So for today's topic, Target Hollywood, China, the Western entertainment industry, symbolically headquartered in Hollywood, and the competition for global influence being played out through popular culture. And to help us understand and tackle this very neat topic, we have with us Dr. Jonathan Ward, the founder of the Atlas Organization, a consultancy that's focused on Asia, China, the Indian subcontinent, and he is the author of a book published last year, China's Vision of Victory, a very eye-opening book. And next to him, we have Dalibor Rohac, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, here in Washington, D.C., and I'm also proud to say a member of the USEA Board of Advisors. And actually, I think the very first one, in fact, Dalibor hails from Slovakia, and I think he's just one of the outstanding young transatlantic leaders on the stage right now. So we're really honored to have both of these great experts with us today. The way this will work is we're going to have a conversation that will hopefully run about somewhere around 45 minutes. I'll ask each of our two guests to spend a few minutes offering some opening remarks, and then we'll go into questions. For those of you joining us on Zoom, please use the chat function if you have a question, and I will do my best to get to as many of those as we possibly can. So with the housekeeping out of the way, let's dive into the topic. And I think I'm going to start with Jonathan. If maybe you could help us frame the issue, help us understand the issue. I think on one hand, many Americans certainly recognize the importance of movies, the importance of films, the importance of the entertainment industry in shaping pop culture. I certainly think about influence on social norms, influence on social justice, but I'm not sure Americans always make the connection to how this is a strategic issue. So if you would you kick us off and help us understand this issue and share some of the ways you think about it?
Right. Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's great to be here. As an expert on Chinese grand strategy, that's the subject of China's Vision of Victory and of all my work in the past leading up to that, in a sense. I find this to be a very important and, in a way, understudied and underappreciated aspect. I mean, as somebody who's done a lot on Chinese military strategy, Chinese diplomatic strategy, industrial strategy, economic strategy, I think one has to remember that there's the incredibly important place in this broader picture of the role of popular culture. And I think it's even bigger than Hollywood. I think Hollywood creates a window for us to begin to see that we're in this competition. I remember when I was watching the NBA moment unfold last year when Daryl Morey was talking about Hong Kong, and I thought, wow, I've been working on China issues for over 10 years, but this may be the first moment in which the problem of China as an adversary, as an authoritarian state that can influence the way that we think about the world or what we're able to do, it's the first time that I thought it might actually reach into the living room of just the average citizen in the United States. I mean, it goes beyond, the Pentagon or the US government, and suddenly it's an issue that all Americans can recognize. And when one looks at the role of Hollywood in this picture, and the fact that, of course, everybody understands that China is a giant box office. Hollywood movies are really geared towards that market, because to be an economic success overseas, I mean, they have to participate in the China market. So that's basically the economics behind this. And that leads to influence over the films themselves. And I think we see many examples of that. I think one of my favorite examples, because it's so atrocious, really, is Top Gun. And that was where, you have the US Navy. It's a film about the US Navy, and yet they've removed Japan and Taiwan from the back of Tom Cruise's jackets, because one of the largest entertainment companies in China is a participant in the film. And of course, that would be hostile to the Chinese interest. And then this summer, I mean, Mulan really, I think, opened the doors to this whole problem in a much bigger way, with the fact that the film was, was filmed near China's concentration camps, where there, known human rights atrocities. Scholars and experts worldwide are calling this a genocide against the Uyghur people. And yet here you have Disney, an iconic American brand, thanking the Public Security Bureau organs that are actually in charge of Xinjiang atrocities. So it's like, how low can you go? How deep is this? How deep are the sort of structural issues of this problem, to the point that we're going to have more Mulans, more Top Guns? And what does this really mean for America? What does it mean for Europe? What does it mean for the free world, which I think at the end of the day is in many ways built upon our open culture and our freedom of expression. So what I'd really like to talk to you about today in my opening remarks is to bring a little bit of primary source information into this. And Vision of Victory is built entirely on primary documents from the Communist Party of China. I mean, that was the subject of my doctorate at Oxford, was working with Chinese archives to understand their strategic ambitions towards other major nations. And then the book itself relies on a very large source space, despite its quite movie poster-esque cover. So, it's essentially a collection of documents. But, the bottom line is looking at the way that the Communist Party is not only intervening in our cultural ecosystem, but also creating one of their own. And what it's doing is it's creating the sort of cultural and intellectual infrastructure to support their ultimate ambition, which they call the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And, to begin with, party control over their own media should be touched upon. Here's Xi Jinping explaining to media professionals in China. He says, the media run by the party and the government are propaganda fronts and must have the party as their family name. All the work by the party's media must reflect the party's will, safeguard the party's authority, and safeguard the party's unity. They must love the party, protect the party, and closely align themselves with party leadership in thought, politics, and actions. That's the party and the media. Then you take something where you have an ideological document that was circulated inside the party. It's called, in 2013, document number 9. It's very famous, I think, among China watchers. But it has, these are the things that the party has to crack down on in their own ideological and cultural sphere. Western constitutional democracy, universal values, including Western liberties, democracies, and human rights, propagating civil society, attempting to deconstruct the social basis for party rule, propagating neoliberalism, attempting to change our country's basic economic system, propagating Western news views, challenging our country's principle that the party manages the media and its press and publications, and then denying the history of the Communist Party and the history of the new China. And then you wind up in this sort of absurd ecosystem where American companies and Western companies that are in the China market are suddenly having to bow to the values of the party. So you wind up with things such as, leaving aside Mulan, which I think we should really talk about in detail. Here is Gap having printed a T-shirt with a map of China on it that did not include China's claims to the South China Sea. Gap put out a statement saying Gap Gap Incorporated respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of China. As a responsible company, Gap Incorporated strictly follows Chinese rules and laws. So then by the time you get to Bob Iger and Michael Eisner in Beijing explaining to Premier Zhu Rongji that we made a mistake releasing Kundun, which is about Tibet. It was a stupid thing to do. And you're talking about a real, grip on the as one journalist put it, on Hollywood's imagination. And when what Hollywood is able to do, what our cultural organs are able to do. I mean, from the NBA to Gap to movie studios. This came out in a Pixar movie, I believe, where there's a map of the South China Sea on the wall of a young girl's room, and then the movie was, everybody was angry in Southeast Asia. So you're basically getting, the most powerful cultural enterprises in the world, in history. I mean, Hollywood, to start to subtly push forward a pro-China narrative, or at least one that makes a commodium with China. And you're doing this in the midst of all kinds of very terrible things, from China's military buildup to the atrocities. And let's think about it this way. I mean, while I have your attention, the propaganda, the organs that were being thanked by Disney in Mulan, I'd like to read a testimony from a survivor of these camps. It's really awful, okay? So the camp's commanders set aside a room for torture, which the inmates dubbed the Black Room because it was forbidden to talk about it explicitly. There were all kinds of tortures there. Some prisoners were hung on the wall and beaten with electrified truncheons. Those were prisoners who were made to sit on chairs of nails. I saw people return from that room covered in blood. Some came back without fingernails. They would punish inmates for everything. Anyone who didn't follow the rules was punished. Those who didn't learn Chinese properly or who didn't sing the songs were also punished. I'll give you an example. There was an old woman in the camp who had been a shepherd before she was arrested. She was taken to the camp because she was accused of speaking with someone from abroad by phone. This was a woman who not only did not have a phone, she did not even know how to use one. On the page the sins of the inmates were forced to fill out, she wrote that the call she had been accused of making never took place. In response, she was immediately punished. I saw her when she returned. She was covered with blood. She had no fingernails and her skin was flayed. Okay, so, when Disney is thanking the institutions that are perpetrating this in the People's Republic of China, I think we might have a problem. In the midst of that, on top of that, surrounding that is the far broader issue of China's quest for supremacy in the international system, China's buildup of military power, China's conflicts with its neighbors, with the United States, China's diplomatic hostilities from India to America to Japan, worldwide. And at the edges of this sits the question of Europe and whether or not the free and Western world will cohere around this problem of China. With all of that, I think there's a lot for us to consider. There's a lot of importance to this question. And the fact that our popular culture could become vulnerable to a foreign government, an authoritarian party state that is committing genuinely horrific acts. This is a very important thing for us to deal with. So thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you for drawing attention to the human rights abuses, the cultural genocide, and really the attempt to eliminate the Uyghurs as a distinctive people. And I've said this elsewhere that I think the Chinese attempt or successful effort to, in some ways, make Disney complicit in that crime does great damage to the image, reputation of America and American business. But before I come back to that in the Q&A, let me turn to Dalibor. And Dalibor, usually this conversation is framed in a U.S.-China, in a very much a bilateral relationship. And I'd like to hear your thoughts, and maybe you can help us expand the aperture, how this plays in Europe. Is there a transatlantic context to this? And maybe even Q&A we can talk about, might there be a transatlantic or a broader response that might be useful to help us think about this not only as a U.S.-China issue?
Absolutely, Scott. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be on the panel with Jonathan. Unlike Jonathan, I can't really claim much expertise on China per se. I'm an economist by training, brought up in Europe, with an interest in transatlantic relations and in all things that have to do with the future of the continent, with the future of the US-EU ties. And I think China has become an issue that is in many ways central to the future of the transatlantic partnership. So my only expertise on China really comes from that angle. And neither am I an expert on the movie industry. I hasten to add. I suppose my perspective on this, like many other people's, is one informed by the experience of the Cold War. Although I was 6 when communism collapsed, one is always reminded of the parallels with the power competition with Soviet Union. But there are important caveats to that. One that was articulated in August by Secretary Pompeo when he went to Prague is that the challenge of resisting the Chinese Communist Party is in some ways greater than in the Soviet case, because the CCP is already enmeshed in our economies, in our politics, in our societies, and in much deeper ways than the Soviet Union. The other difference is, and this might be somewhat speculative, but my sense is that unlike the Soviet threat, the Chinese version of communism does not really offer an exportable version of its ideology. It doesn't really offer an exportable ideology that will try to convert others to its cause. I mean, the goal, if I may speculate in this way, of Chinese soft power is really to shatter the constraints that have been imposed on the country and to sort of clear the way towards its hegemony in China, in Asia and Pacific, rather than convert others to some larger ideological cause. So these incidents that we hear about, whether it's the Mulan film or the removal of the Taiwanese and Japanese flag from Maverick's jacket in Top Gun, to me are really disputes about power, right? It's about the Chinese ability to dictate us the terms of our interactions, and I think these cases that Jonathan mentioned are in some ways only the tip of the iceberg. I think there is a larger problem going through the film industry. Even with Mulan, it's not just about the fact that it was shot in Xinjiang province. The folk tale about the girl who enlists in the military, something that sort of bound to resonate with the Chinese audiences. It's aimed at Chinese audiences. The fact that villains have turbans and dark skins, reminiscent of the Uyghurs. You have to wonder whether that's accidental or not. But for Disney, it's really a display of fairly bad judgment to get into this line of business. In Mission Impossible 3, a scene of Tom Cruise's character killing a Chinese killer was dutifully cut out. In Skyfall, the execution of a Chinese security guard was cut out. Any references to torture by Chinese agents were removed in the Chinese version. Very often, kisses between members of the same sex are cut out from films in the Chinese versions. In Star Trek Beyond, for example, in Alien Covenant, there were also some scrub given to the Bohemian Rhapsody film on Freddie Mercury. In the Marvel Comics films, film Doctor Strange, a Tibetan monk is replaced by Tilda Swinton for some reason. There's also an unspoken sort of theme of, something that's sort of sometimes called a cultural preference for lighter skin, which, whether we like it or not, degenerates into various versions of racism. And there's a strange paradox really with the film industry where after after the George Floyd killing and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the film industry was able to react very quickly to that by embracing these diversity requirements for films seeking Oscar nominations. So, to be eligible for the Academy Awards, one lead or significant actor must be from an underrepresented film, or at least 30% of secondary actors have to be from an underrepresented group, or the storyline of the film has to be relevant to the underrepresented groups. And yet, it's the same Academy Awards that were, in 2015, Star Wars The Force Awakens was given 5 nominations for the 88th awards, and on the Chinese posters, very conspicuously, the English actor John Boyega was downsized relative to the Western versions, which was implicitly justified by the Chinese preference for lighter skins. Days later, the same actor was removed from the Chinese version of a new promotional film made for Joe Malone, the British perfume and perfume company. It was replaced by an Asian actor. The sort of willingness of Hollywood to bend itself backward, I think, can be explained by 2 reasons. One is the lack of an organized sort of push against such accommodation from the West or from other Asian audiences outside of China, and simultaneously the importance of China as the market for films, whether it's the box office. So in 2018, the global box office was around $42 billion, of which China accounted for around 9 billion. So it's pretty significant. There has been a lot of growth. So China would now have 70,000 cinemas, relative to 4,000 in 2005. Obviously, home entertainment is a much bigger chunk of the filmmakers' revenue than cinemas, but there is obviously massive growth on that front in China as well. So the question is, what can be done with that? I think some responses might involve policy, and we'll get into this in the discussion, I'm sure. But some responses might involve actual policymakers in the West doing something, and the more consensus you get on these measures across the Atlantic, I think the more effective they can be. U.S. Department of Commerce already has a sanction list for Chinese entities that operate in the Xinjiang province. It's around 50 companies, I believe, at the moment. There is no reason why that list shouldn't be longer, and why there shouldn't be clear lines imposed by U.S. policymakers on U.S. companies such as Disney, who want to make business in China and shoot their films there. Obviously, there are limits to how far those policy responses can go. That's the challenge of the economic integration we have in China. That really, we can't disentangle ourselves from one day to the next through coercive measures. And obviously, there are also unintended consequences. So I remember when the Dodd-Frank Act was passed, there was a provision introduced into it that aimed at essentially prohibiting the use of minerals coming from conflict areas by the high-tech industry. So things like tin, tantalum, gold, and tungsten, these like rare metals that are used in the production of chips, and the implementation of that. It was well-intentioned law, and I thought it was a good idea to have it. So producers would have to declare the origin of the metals, of the rare minerals they were using, to make sure that they don't come from areas where there is an ongoing civil war, and especially this sort of the Great Lakes region of Africa. But the problem was with the implementation, that effectively discouraged producers from relying on any minerals or metals coming from the concerned areas of Africa, which translating it into the movie context might create a sort of perverse incentive, like not to engage with the Chinese at all. And I would argue that I think there are benefits in Chinese audiences being exposed Western culture, and sort of cutting the ties altogether might not be particularly useful if the idea is to help push China in a more liberal and democratic direction over the very long term. So apart from explicit policy and coercive measures by governments, I think what is important is to create public pressure, the same way BLM created pressure on the movie making industry, and I think we need something like that, without pronouncing any judgment on the diversity quotas and the BLM question. But I think that sort of model of how you shape the industry is the same. We need pressure on the industry to adopt some sort of ethical standards that would not make it just not okay to operate in the Xinjiang province, or to cut out scenes at the demand of Chinese censors. You could get big home entertainment companies involved, Netflix and Hulu, that could pre-commit not to buy rights to films like Mulan. And I think it would require constant vigilance by the public, and also I think reaching out. Let me know if you need help on that front. I'd be keen to go and talk to Harrison Ford and Richard Gere and all these other film stars that have been banned from China because of their explicit support for Tibet. And I think the goal in this sort of on this narrow question is really to make Chinese censors work for their money. The West shouldn't be making it easy for them. And I think the more heavy-handed and more ham-fisted their interventions are within China, scrubbing foreign films themselves, I think the more questions might be asked by the Chinese public. And I think that's ultimately a good film, a good thing. So just as an example, so World War Z was banned from China because of Brad Pitt's views on Tibet. I'm sure Chinese audiences are aware of the film's existence. Some people might be asking questions. I think if Chinese censors want to ban something, let them do it. Let's not do it preemptively. That would be my main message. And I think for that, it would require concerted action here in the West and a sort of broader cultural change to put pressure on the industry.
And Dalibor, on that note, let me bring in Jonathan. And I want to, I agree with everything you said, and I want to maybe put a fine point on it and challenge Jonathan on a point. I think this issue of sanctioning companies for their involvement in the occupied Uyghur area of China is a good start, but we've seen this response by the Chinese government, where now there's issues of Western companies doing business there. So now they've begun to move Uyghur forced laborers to other parts of China to make that distinction less meaningful, and to blur those lines. And in this entertainment context, we're talking about the example of Mulan, and there's many examples, a shocking number of examples, I think, of Western films being changed to please Beijing. But in the Mulan example, Jonathan, can I ask you, we're focusing on the credits and the thanks given to the security services and this portion of the film that was filmed in East Turkestan. But can I ask, would Mulan have been okay? Would there have been an issue if that credit had not been there? If Disney had maybe been a little bit more maybe careful and hadn't put that in there, would there still be an issue with Mulan, or is there a broader, deeper underlying challenge with films like that?
I think that the issue you've got with Mulan is not just that credit; it's really structural. I mean, you go back to Michael Eisner speaking with Premier Zhu Rongji in the 90s, and he says, "I want to apologize, for Kundun. In the future, we should prevent this sort of thing, which insults our friends, from happening." He says, the bad thing was that the film was made. The good thing is that nobody watched it. So you're talking about a structural aspect of corporate strategy that has to do with censorship of these sorts of things. It's not simply, the credit was sort of the tell. but that structural problem of, look, we're going to do this because of the China market. You know, we're going to ignore these issues. I mean, I'm sure somebody was saying to them, are you sure you want to be filming in Xinjiang now? I mean, by then this had been so well known worldwide. At this point, it's so well documented that it's impossible to deny. There are those that do that, but, you know, leaving that aside, if you're in a place where, you know, corporate decision-making basically ignores those voices, you're going to wind up with a situation like this, which reveals, I think, a far bigger problem. So I think, you know, those credits were simply a tip-off to a much larger issue. And then it reverberates across everything. I mean, you know, as Dalibor was saying, I mean, you have movie stars that have been banned in China. I mean, you used to have, you know, films made about Tibet, about the Dalai Lama, about these sorts of things. And those stories are no longer told in the West. That's the thing that we have to remind ourselves what we're doing, because, you know, movie making, you know, has been one of the most important expressions of our values, of our culture, of our meaning as a society. It brings people together across the planet. And if there are going to be stories that are no longer, that we can't tell anymore, because they don't comport with China's ideology from the party. I mean, you're talking about a far more successful, you know, Chinese vision than we might understand we're dealing with. And I think that creates, you know, another example of what can be done here is simply alternative movie studios. I mean, we're going to need new movie studios that help us explain the problem that we're faced with here, because this is not just about, you know, it's not only about culture and stories and freedom of expression. It's about the recognition, the broad spectrum awareness that we're in a major existential competition with an adversary that does these sorts of things. I mean, we're not talking about the military competition. I mean, this summer, the Pentagon released its annual report to Congress on China and explained that China now has the world's largest Navy, the largest air forces in the Indo-Pacific, largest Coast Guard, and you add all this up, you know, Chinese soldiers have, you know, killed neighboring soldiers for the first time in the 21st century on the Indian border this summer. I mean, these are real things. And if we're going to be insensate to that, I mean, when I look at this as part of China's real broader grand strategy, which is military, diplomatic, technological, it's across every industry, the Hollywood operations are essentially to euthanize the patient. I mean, we're the patient on a table, the American global order, the free world order. They want to make sure that we're put under while they go about and do their thing, you know, preparing their military to defend their expanding overseas interests, prepare their companies to go out and, you know, expand their capabilities in world markets. I mean, there's a much bigger strategy here. But if we can't recognize that, it will be because we've been blinded, both by our engagement with China and by our own censorship.
I certainly like that that notion or idea of having to create a new industry with new markets, and I think that you know, makes a lot of sense for the transatlantic relationship. If China can't be that market, India, Japan, Europe, I think makes a lot of sense. Dalibor, you know, going back to you know, I'm sure if I were to Google Europe, you know, information warfare, disinformation, propaganda, you know, 99.9% of the returns would be about Russia. And since Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, there's, I think we've become more comfortable discussing Russian information operations and the way Russia connects entertainment with news. And you kind of come for the entertainment, maybe you stay for the news. And you know, and since you're, you know, in the conversations you have with European leaders or you know, the European public, do you find that people make a connection that, you know, we've been talking about Russia for several years now? Do people make the connection that, well, there's also you know, government organized, sponsored influence happening not only through news and investment and business, but also through entertainment, and that involves China? Is that on the radar in Europe?
I think policymakers across Europe are waking up to the Chinese challenge in a way that would have been almost unthinkable a few years ago. I think part of that is a recognition that the Chinese challenge and the Russian challenge are different, including on the front of soft power and disinformation. Whereas in the Russian case, the propaganda was really aimed at erasing the boundary between reality and unreality and creating 15 different versions of everything that was in the news, whether it was the shooting down of MH17 or annexation of Crimea or the events in currently unfolding in Belarus. Chinese influence, information-wise, I think has been quite different in the sense that it really was not trying necessarily to convert people to a cause or just flood the information space with different narratives, but it was really about testing our commitment to the freedom of expression and free speech. That there are, Chinese diplomacy has been extremely effective and rapid in responding to things that they don't want to be said, whether it's about Tibet, whether it's about the Xinjiang province, about South China Sea, about Taiwan, and so there has been an effective silencing of some sort of ways of some parts of perfectly legitimate policy debates in the West. Earlier, a few weeks ago, actually, the Speaker of the Czech Senate, Miloš Vystrčil, made a trip to Taiwan that was met with an extremely hostile reaction from China, and I think that sort of underscored the limits of sort of Chinese sort of power and their influence in Europe, because the response was so heavy-handed and so clumsy, and the threatening language was just so inappropriate that other European leaders essentially came to the Czech Republic's defense, I think for very good reasons. So, but by and large, when you sort of blend politics and business, you can end up with an effective silencing of some parts of our conversations. And I think that's what's at stake with this broader question of films and of the film industry. It's not different from the question that surrounded the shootings at Charlie Hebdo and the controversies over Prophet Muhammad's cartoons in Denmark, right? Like, are we willing to sort of award the heckler's veto to the one who sort of shouts and protests the loudest? And I think to me the answer should be definitely not. I mean, the problem is that the West's own commitment to freedom of expression might be in question as we speak. There has been a movement in the academia, in the broader intellectual world, the rise of the so-called cancel culture, which might be posing a challenge of its own in conjunction with the Chinese challenge, right? Like, if we give certain groups the power to veto or silence other groups, why shouldn't we afford it to the Chinese government that feels offended by certain content, whose feelings are being heard? It's funny how very often the Chinese regime frames its response to various transgressions by Western policymakers or intellectuals by like its feelings being hurt by the mention of Tibet or the persecution of Uyghurs and so forth. And I think the regime is really keen to exploit that crack that has opened, if you will, over the recent years in the West's commitment to free speech and freedom of expression.
We've chatted a little bit about the past and a little bit of examples of how this actually plays out. I'd like to kind of turn towards the future, and certainly in U.S.-China discussions, the active debate is around decoupling and how people react to that term, how they define it. And I think certainly I would argue we're seeing a selective decoupling in some areas. And maybe, Jonathan, I'll start with you. I'm curious how, I haven't seen or heard the entertainment industry be brought up in the context of decoupling. And might it make sense to talk about this being an area where the US industry and the Chinese industry have become too commingled? And maybe this might be a topic that's right to insert into the conversation or the debate about decoupling. How do you react to that?
Sure. I mean, this is an important piece of this picture. I mean, decoupling, as we all understand it, is chiefly concentrated in strategic industries, whether that's semiconductors or technology or, emerging technologies that will matter to a variety of sectors, from automotive to aerospace to shipbuilding, you name it, right? Whole wide thing of what we think of as essentially industrial power or dual use. But when you think about the entertainment industry, I think the other thing I wanted to bring up here is China's creation of its own sort of film industry that's advancing very different narratives that we might not recognize unless you're fully immersed in China, as some of us have done. These are the narratives of the Communist Party. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I think the best, most famous, known example is the movie Wolf Warrior 2, where it was the largest single market in any box office, or largest box office in any single market other than Avatar and Titanic at the time of its release. It was China's submission to the Academy Awards as a foreign film. And yet very few people in the West have watched it, or, not everyone has really even heard of it. And this film was basically about Chinese soldiers operating in an unnamed African country. And it basically ends with a giant display of Chinese firepower, into these places. And there's a giant Chinese passport that goes up on the screen at the end, and it says, "Citizens of the People's Republic of China, when you are in danger overseas, please do not give up. Remember that behind you, there's a strong and powerful fatherland." That's my translation from China's Vision of Victory. And the tagline of the movie, as it was advertised, was "fan wo zhonghua zhi sui yan bi zhu," which means those who offend our China must be executed, even if they're far away. So I used to wonder, when I was living and traveling widely in China, when I'd meet young people my age telling me they wanted to go to war with Japan or India or the Philippines or America, or they were always talking about war and such. And there are party magazines that advocate for using nuclear weapons against American cities and such. All of this is in Chinese language. And as China goes out and builds a more sophisticated military enterprise, as its national interests expand through trade ties and investment, and as they begin to promote this narrative of protecting their overseas interest, they're also creating a culture around this narrative of sort of military power, expanded global interests, and the need to defend these things. So you basically have military nationalism finding its way into popular culture, not only in the magazines and television shows that you would see regularly in China, but also in film. And in the most popular films. That's the thing that's most interesting about this. So when you think about the separation of these two systems, leaving aside the economic side, which is frankly what I spend most of my time on at Atlas, where we advise companies. But what we really have is a different worldview. And that's what fascinated me personally about China when I was a young person learning foreign languages and studying there. I just wanted to understand, their sense of where this country was going, where it had come from, what it was now. And it's an utterly different worldview. I mean, if you had a history of the world in Chinese language, it would be utterly different than the histories of the world that we write in the West. So it should be no surprise that there's an entirely different cultural enterprise going on here to not only explain the past and the present, but to justify the potential actions in the future.
Thank you. I'm so happy you mentioned the film Wolf Warrior. And as I was preparing for this conversation, I was really struck by this question. I kept kind of repeating to myself. I couldn't figure out if for Hollywood, if China was the big new market or a competitor. And I couldn't figure out which one of those more aptly described China. And I'm sure the answer to some degree is both. But I think that inherent tension between those two things will just increase in the coming years. Dalibor, let me turn to you as we kind of come to the conclusion of our conversation. And I'd like to get your response to any of this, and also ask what can the U.S. do to help make sure Europe is included as part of this conversation and as an ally in the solution. I'm very aware that while the film industry in Europe isn't huge, it's not small either, and many more European films go to China than go to the U.S. So is there a way for for a decoupling or a little bit of a break between Hollywood and China, not to make Europe collateral damage or not to push Europe into being more reliant on the China market once that division occurs.
So one thing that needs to be said is that Europe's film industry is smaller, is fragmented, and in a way that might be an advantage from a policy perspective, because obviously movies in Europe are oftentimes dependent on public funding and on support from governments, and so having a code of ethics or some sort of commitment to broad principles in the production of films in place, I think might be actually easier to implement in a place like Europe than in the United States, where really the government has no leverage over, or very little leverage over, big Hollywood producers. And talking about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but as a sort of matter of fact, like if European governments were to recognize the Chinese challenge, I think they could actually get much further with their own film industries than the US government at the present time. I think going forward, the important thing is to keep the transatlantic dialogue alive and vibrant on these matters. I was happy for one that Secretary Pompeo went on this charm offensive across Central European capitals in the summer and in the spring, and he was in Denmark and Slovenia, the Czech Republic, and these are places that don't get a visit from the U.S. Secretary of State very often. That were neglected during Obama years. The current administration did not really lead to a renaissance in transatlantic relations, to say the least. So I appreciate every little effort that actually takes place, and it has made a difference in these four countries. The sort of sense that they are not being abandoned by the United States, I think, is still powerful symbolically and also practically going forward. I think it's going to be important to have a dialogue at the EU level, like when we talk about intellectual property and trade and the sort of broader economic tools that could be deployed to counter Chinese influence. And this takes us much further from the narrow question of filmmaking, but on those questions, I think having a Brussels DC dialogue is important, because it's just not conceivable that the US policymakers would deal individually with 27 member states and the UK. So I think it's important to just invest into that conversation, and the broader goal in my mind in this sphere of culture should not be decoupling. I don't think we are threatened just because Chinese communism and the regime does not really offer an exportable alternative. The sort of Xi-style nationalism is not going to gain converts per se in Western democracies. I think the sort of danger that Western culture might pose to the long-term survival of the Chinese regime is much greater than in films like Wolf Warrior might pose to European democracies. It's not like the Russian sort of propagandistic model which tries to flood our information space with nonsense and then confuse voters, etc. It's more about the nefarious Chinese influence to sort of stop certain conversations from taking place, especially as they pertain to Asia and the role of China. So I think there is an interest that we have in keeping the flow of sort of culture and information from the West to China alive in some way. And I think a sort of heavy-handed effort to decouple might be dangerous for that broader goal.
I'd like to add something to that, which is, I mean, you think of the importance of something like Radio-Free Europe or Asia in the Cold War. Yeah. I mean, were some of the most important aspects of Western strategy in the Cold War. And, I think you're absolutely right, Dalibor, that this is not about exporting Chinese culture to the world. This is about unifying the Chinese public behind the goals of the party. The party's political philosophy is expressed in this concept that there are 1 billion people, and with the party's, leadership or control, they will reach this great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. I mean, that is the political philosophy of the Communist Party of China, is backed by the invincible force of 1.4 billion people. We have an infinite stage for our era. That's what they say. So bottom line, it's like we're going to want to, I think, have these sort of beaming in alternative views, ideas, concepts to show that there's this broader world out there. And at the same time, I think it's really important that we have access to that party view. When I was in my early 20s as somebody who spoke fluent Chinese and I spent months in Xinjiang and Tibet and going all over China. I mean, if I hadn't had the language, if I hadn't had exposure to people at a village level, reading the media of the party, speaking the language of the party, I never would have had any idea. I mean, most of the Americans I met in 2006 and 2007, when I first started going to China, were there to visit a factory or think about investing, or Shanghai, Beijing, Hong Kong, Shenzhen. There's a much deeper thing there, and we need to have a lot of awareness of that. And culture is going to be one of the most important ways we can see the party talking to its people, and that's going to create a far bigger understanding of what we're dealing with at all times, because we always have to understand that, particularly as access gets ratcheted down, which it will. And just one other thing. I mean, I think what everyone's been saying, Dalibor and Scott, like just the U.S.-Europe alliance is so vital to freedom in this century. I mean, we can't survive, we can't succeed. We'll be in enormous trouble if Europe and America do not come together. So we have to. And I think if you look at the international relationships around the world, I mean, the US-India relationship is flourishing. The US-Japan relationship is always going to be made stronger by these issues. It's creating these networks in Asia that are so important. And for Europe to look at the world in terms of how the democracies are beginning to react to the problem of China, I mean, we need Europe to become part of this alliance of democracies, part of this broader thing that at the end of the day hinges really around the US-European relationship, India's relationship with both the United States and Europe, and then the allied nations of Asia. I mean, if that's all brought together, you're talking about such a powerful group, a powerful coalition that we will withstand this challenge from China and its adherents. And we also can't forget that the Russia-China relationship is central to China's broader strategic ambitions. So for Europe to be dealing with Russia as a problem, but ignoring China as the backer of that problem, the underwriter of those issues, that would be wrong. So I think Brussels and also across the capitals, from London to Paris and certainly Berlin, that's going to be very important. We have to start thinking globally about these issues and making sure that the US-European alliance is one of the key foundations. That will be the entire secret to success.
Well, I could not have said that better myself. So thank you for that. I think that's an appropriately positive and optimistic spot for us to end our conversation today. Thank you, Dalibor. Thank you, Jonathan. It's a great conversation. I'm very happy we had it. And thank you to the audience, to everyone who joined us. Thank you for being here. And please tune in. Our next event will be on October 6th. And until then, everyone, please take care.
Thank you.
Scott, thank you.